Oh, hi. Welcome to Aquata Zoo, where we like to nerd out over all things zoo and aquarium related. I'm l.semple, and today I'd like to talk to you about actions versus outcomes. This is a topic that kind of comes up in the zoo and aquarium world pretty regularly, particularly when we're talking about animals and our intent with their care and that sort of thing. And so I figured I would talk about how it applies to other things as well. This ties in a bit with goal setting, whether it's personal, whether it's work related, whatever you're trying to do. When you're trying to set some goals, it's important to remember what the difference is between actions and outcomes. Actions tends to be what we're going to do, and the outcomes tend to be why we're doing it, right? So if you're going to do some goal setting, more than likely you're going to have a little bit better of a result if you're looking more at the why, the outcomes, than you are the what, the specifically how you're going to get there, right? So in zoos and aquariums, when we use this, we're talking about usually, like, for example, enrichment. So what we're trying to do is something like provide an animal an opportunity to do a natural behavior. So it might be, digging and foraging for food, right? So that's what we're trying to get them to engage in, because that's what they would naturally do in their habitat if they lived out there in the wild, right? And so what we try to do then is have that outcome in mind, what we're hoping will happen. It's not necessarily going to be the thing that happens, but that's what we're aiming for, right? So we want them to forage. What can we do to get there? Well, we could hide some food around. We could put out some interesting scents. We could, change things up and put in a novel item that is made like a puzzle feeder, made to kind of encourage some problem solving and thought, right? So there's lots of options there, but the end goal is to try and reach the point where the animal is engaging in this natural behavior, because that's what it would spend a lot of time doing anyway if it were left to its own devices, not living in a zoo or aquarium, right? So that's why we focus more on what we hope will be the outcome, and then we back it up and try to decide how we're going to get there. Why do we do it that way? It gives us a little bit more freedom and a little bit more creativity, I suppose, when we're trying to figure out, hey, I want this behavior to be the one that we're going for, and how do we get there? Like, there's 100 different routes you can take, right? It could be an item. It could be changing up what's already there. It could be adding some scents. It could be, changing the time of day that something happens. There's a lot of different things that you can do to reach that goal. And it may not always work out, but you're kind of keeping track of, is this working or is this not, based on the outcome you're aiming for. So if I were looking for a foraging behavior for an animal and I try a few things, one of them doesn't really work that well, I'm going to probably toss that one out or modify it so that it does kind of result in what I'm looking for, So it just gives me a gauge, I suppose, to look at what's happening and decide if that's the correct route, if that's a way to get there, if that's what we want to continue doing in the future, if that's going to continue bringing about this outcome that we're looking for. And, we can adjust accordingly. So a similar kind of thing goes for people and their lives and their work stuff and their goals. A lot of us tend to set, say, for New Year's, a resolution that they want to do. I want to go to the gym at least 5 times a week, right? It's, ambitious. If you're going 4 times a week currently, it doesn't seem like such a stretch to go 5 times a week, right? But what's the point? What are we trying to get to? It's part of the reason that people feel, even though some folks don't love New Year's resolutions, it's really hard to mess them up, I guess, and feel like you've failed at them. But I think it's a lot of the time because we're not focused on the outcome, we're focused on the action involved. And so you kind of lose sight of what the goal was, what that outcome that you had envisioned would have been. And so it's hard to, skip a day here and there, if I'm using the gym as my example, right? It's hard if you got sick, let's say, and you didn't go to the gym for a full week because you were ill. It's hard to get back into it. A, because you're still recovering. B, because now you're out of practice, and you could just say that you have ruined your chances at completing your New Year's resolution, right? But it wasn't really about physically going to the gym. Like, there's a point to it. Assuming you want to have something like, oh, I'd like to lose some weight, or oh, I'd like to be a little bit healthier. I'd like my endurance to be better, or I'd like my strength to be better, or something like that. Though that's more of like an outcome, right? Of going to the gym. And so those New Year's resolutions can be a little tough because if you quote unquote mess it up, you didn't really, like, it's not that big of a deal. But if you feel like you have failed at it, it's hard to get on board with it again, because you've already felt all the feelings about not making it. You set this goal for yourself. You should have been able to do it. You couldn't do it. How dare you? And you start feeling, a lot of things about that intent that you had to do that action, however much you planned on doing it. But really, the outcome is what you were aiming for. So say you did get sick, right? You didn't go to the gym for a full week. So how do you get back into it? If your goal was to, say, increase your endurance, you just start again, right? You do what your body can do at that point. If you're still recovering from an illness, it's probably not going to be a whole lot. But that's okay, because you got sick. You have not been able to go to the gym for a week, so you're slightly out of practice, right? It's not the end of the world. The goal is still there. The goal is still attainable. That outcome that you're aiming for is what matters. It's not, oh, I didn't go to the gym 5 times last week because I was sick, therefore I should just give up on this goal, right? When we focus too much on the what rather than the why, I feel like we're more prone to failure and not understanding what the point was in the beginning. And so it's a little confusing to set goals based on what versus why. And so I'm just encouraging everyone to think about the outcome rather than the action. When I think about this sort of thing, I think about the folks who are naturally gifted at stuff, right? Like the natural athlete or the natural musician or something like that, where if somebody just has a talent for something, they just pick things up really quickly. You might have something like that. And so they're so used to just going in there and succeeding at whatever it is without any formal training, without any practice. When they encounter something that they're not good at, it can be super frustrating, right? Because they're going in there thinking, I should be able to play this guitar for 20 minutes and just be good at it, right? Not that anybody literally thinks that, but some people are just like naturally gifted at this kind of thing. Some people can do that, right? So there's a difference here, because you wouldn't go in expecting to play your guitar for 20 minutes and be a master most of the time, unless you have natural talent for that. And so is the goal to play the guitar for 20 minutes, or is the goal to learn how to play guitar? That's the kind of difference that we're looking at here. Sure, if you dedicate 20 minutes to this activity every day, or, as often as you can, you're going to get to the point where you meet that outcome where you have learned guitar. People who are naturally talented for these sorts of things, and it doesn't always have to be music, it could be sports, it could be, I feel like I'm naturally talented at school at learning, but if you go into it being naturally talented at some of these things and just picking them up, you still met the goal. You're trying to learn the skill, you're trying to learn the language, the musical instrument, the sport, right? And you're naturally good at it. For those of us who are not, we have to work at it, and that's okay. You can still make it as far as those naturally talented people. You just have to keep in mind the goal, the outcome that you're aiming for, rather than the action. I've seen people be very hard on themselves when they are not meeting the goals that they have set for themselves. They've put it in their head that they want to do some sort of thing, X amount of times a week, some amount of times a day. And it can lead to frustration if they don't meet those expectations that they put for themselves, that their boss may have actually put out for them, right? So even in the workplace, sometimes the people around us can also be a little bit too action focused rather than outcome focused, and they don't even realize it. They're not really thinking about it. They're like, hey, I need you to do this, every day. But what's the goal? Do you want them to learn the task? Do you want them to really understand what's going on with this item or this industry or this practice, To have the outcome in mind rather than the action is really helpful, because guess what? There's lots of different ways that you can get there, and it might not be turning in that report every week or practicing this for 20 minutes a day. It could be there could be other ways to get there that are not the way that your linear mind is thinking that you do it. So it's just good to keep the outcome in mind rather than just the action, because the outcome is probably more important than what the singular action is. And we're all different. We all have different ways of learning. We all have different ways of approaching things, of thinking about stuff. And so the idea that my way of learning, the way I learned this thing, is going to be the way that you have to learn it is kind of small-minded, right? Everybody's got different ways. Everybody's got different priorities, different, styles. And so for me to press mine upon someone else, assuming that they're going to learn it the exact same way that I did, is not going to be very helpful. And it will kind of make people feel like, you don't know them very well, or you don't understand how they learn, or they're going to feel a little bit more stressed out because they're trying to learn it the way that you did, and it's not working for them because they're different. So that's what we're talking about. This is the silliest, most simplistic version of this. But at one point, I was training somebody to work with some animals. They were doing a feeding, and it was taking a little bit longer, than it did for other people. And so I was not the only trainer on this. There were other trainers as well. And, we were just like, I'm not sure what's going on here. What's going on? Why is this not working? It wasn't until I took a step back and really examined what was going on from the goals that we had set and observing what was actually physically happening in the space at that as it was happening, I guess. And so the goal had been to teach this person how to feed some animals. It was a little complicated because it was a weird location. We're using tools for it. It took a lot of coordination and a lot of looking around. You're watching for the animals that you're trying to feed, but also watching for other animals who can interfere. There was a lot to it. And, everybody was thinking, well, maybe this person's getting overwhelmed by what's happening, because it's a lot to keep track of. Maybe they're just not cut out for this. Whatever. There was a lot of guesses as to what was going wrong. And so I was looking at it like, okay, what are we trying to do here? The whole idea was that we were trying to make sure that the right animals got the right food, right? That's what we were trying to do. We're trying to make sure that the feeding goes off without a hitch. It doesn't necessarily matter how somebody learns how to do it, but we just want the animals to get fed appropriately, right? So with that in mind, in my brain, just make sure that those animals get fed, right? I then watched what was happening, and I could see the tools that we were using. There was some fumbling going on, and it wasn't so much, I could tell that it wasn't the idea of watching for animals, the ones that we were trying to feed, as well as the ones that might interfere. That didn't seem to be a problem. There was very much awareness happening, but there was a lot of fumbling with the food, with the tools, and then I realized why. This person was left-handed, and all the rest of us were right-handed. It was not intentional, but we were basically training this person, you have to do it this way because this is just how we all do it, not taking into account that this person was left-handed, the rest of us were right-handed, and so this person was like struggling with the food and the tools, trying to get everything right because they were using their non-dominant hand, which just makes things unnecessarily complicated. And so as soon as I realized it, I told them to stop. And then I reshuffled how the feeding station was laid out to give them some advantage with their dominant hand. And all of a sudden, it was like perfection. I knew that they had the talent for it. I knew that they were aware of what was going on. But, when we talked about it afterwards, they didn't even realize that that was what was wrong, right? They were just trying to do it the way that they were being taught to do it. We were too focused on the action and not the outcome, right? So that is something that we need to keep in mind when we're setting goals for ourselves, when we're training other people, like I was trying to do and doing a very poor job of it until I realized what was wrong. Because I learned it a certain way, that did not mean that that person had to learn it the same way, right? Because that wasn't going to work for them. That the right hand was not their dominant hand. And so just by recognizing the goal here, the outcome we're looking for is a peaceful feeding for these, where the animals are getting the food that they need. There are no other animals that are interfering. Everybody's safe. All of those things. Those were the goals. Those were the outcomes we were looking for. How we got there mattered less, right? We didn't all have to do it the exact same way, mimicking each other, move for move. It's all about how you learn, how you're comfortable, and kind of taking away those obstacles that are making it unnecessarily hard. So that's my example, my very simplistic example of how I realized we were focusing too hard on the action and not the outcome. Be aware of this when you're setting goals with your supervisor as well, because there may be some actions that sneak in there when the outcome is actually something different. I've had instances where I was told to maybe improve communication between departments, and to try and send out an email once a week, right? And so I got really focused on sending out the email every week, but then I realized that it wasn't really helping. It was helping some people, but it wasn't helping all of the people in the other departments, right? It was only the people who directly received that email and then chose to read it that it was helping to, distribute information and let people know what was going on with animals and whatnot. That's what the purpose was. And so then we started to print out the emails. So, and I would post them out on a bulletin board where anyone could read them. So it wasn't just the people that were receiving the email. It was also the people who did not have, an organizational email address, or honestly, guests. Guests could stop by and read that too. It was, tailored for an audience that I wanted to, have some fun with it and inform, but also entertain a little bit, just to improve the communication about animals, around animals, what's going on with their collection. Here's what's happening. Stuff that I don't have a problem, talking about. I'm not ashamed. I'm not hiding anything. And so that was just a different way to accomplish the goal when I realized that the previous quote unquote goal, which was actually, and it was an action, they wanted me to email once a week. And so that wasn't really working. That was not accomplishing the goal, which I thought was just to improve communications between the departments. And it was. That was the outcome we were looking for, was improved communication. So for a while there, people were excited to see it. And it wasn't anything really fancy. I would take the same email and I would print that email and put it on the board. It wasn't any extra time or effort, really. I would just print it and post it. But people would be waiting to see that email just to see what interesting, facts or, details about animals that they've been wondering about, it would come out in that email and on that board. And, nobody had to sit there and watch their email. Nobody had to just wonder. Of course, they could always ask us. That's also an option. But if they were curious and they happened to be in the area doing something else or waiting for someone or something like that, it was in an area that people would congregate from time to time. And so they could just read it right there on the bulletin board. The goal was the outcome was, we wanted to improve communications between departments. I was told to email once a week, but that wasn't quite effective like we wanted it to be. And that's okay. I was still doing it. Technically, I was meeting the goal. I could have just stopped right there. What they told me, what they wanted me to do, the action was email once a week. Great. I could have just gone home after that, right? I had done what they told me to do. But the actual intent, the outcome we were looking for was improved communication, and it did work. Just by adding one more step, not a big deal. And I was happy to do it, and everything did better after that, right? We improved communication and improved relationships between departments, which was a goal. We just didn't really word it that way. I say that because I just want you to keep that in mind when you're getting requests from your supervisor or requests from your coworkers. They want you to do something. They want you to take on a responsibility. Just keep in mind the difference between actions and outcomes, because that'll make it a lot easier and it'll be more effective, right? Because if they tell you to do an action, it's something that they want you to do this once a week or once a month or whatever. Sure, you can do that, but also keep in mind what the actual outcome that they want to see is, so that if you find that the action they've asked you to do is not effective enough, you have the freedom to think about it and come up with a new solution. It kind of frees up your brain a little bit to be a little bit more creative about it. I'm not a particularly creative person, but I am pretty observant. So if I see that something is not working the way I want it to, then it kind of gets me thinking about other ways to get there, to get to the point where I want to see a change or see the shift in what I'm looking at, right? And so if I think about things in that way, like how else can I get there? Other than this one linear path that I was told was the way, right? It frees up my brain a little bit to think about the outcome rather than the action, just because I can have a little bit of more wiggle room and freedom to think about it in a creative way, so that I can come up with another avenue to get there that is not the same one that was told to me by my coworker or my supervisor or something like that. So just keep that in mind when you're hearing tasks that people want you to do. That's probably more of an action, and keep in mind what their intent is, the goal, the outcome that they're aiming for, because that's a little bit more important, and you can get there by various different methods. Keep those outcomes in mind, because it will make you less likely to beat yourself up if things do not go according to plan, right? There are always things that are going to set us back some, and there are ways that we're going to feel like we've let ourselves down, but we haven't. It's okay. You can easily look at what the goal is, look at what the outcome you're aiming for is, and just pivot. You can do it another way, learn it in another avenue, figure it out, and still attain that goal without having lost any momentum, right? And even if you did lose some, it's not the end of the world. The important part is that outcome. Also, make sure that your actions actually lead to your outcome. If you're going to go into the action part of it, the steps, the pieces, the what, as opposed to the why, just understand how they're connected. I hope that one leads to the other, right? I hope that the thing that you're trying to do, because that's what you have decided needs to be done, does in fact lead to what your intended outcome is. If you're learning a musical instrument, more than likely, it's less about the amount of time or the frequency that you're trying to get to, rather than the ability to learn to play that instrument fully, right? To understand how that instrument works and how to fluidly play it like you're not even thinking about it, right? You want to learn how to play the instrument, not necessarily practice for 25 minutes per day, right? If you have to skip because you're sick, if you have to skip because you have other duties and responsibilities that you need to take care of, don't beat yourself up over that. The point is that you're trying to learn the musical instrument, and these little setbacks are not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. So don't get too mad at yourself. Don't lose your momentum. It's okay. You are still making progress towards that outcome that you're aiming for, which is, in this case, learning that instrument. Also understand when the actions themselves are not enough to meet the outcome. So like in the animal enrichment example that I gave, the way to achieve perhaps a digging or foraging activity or behavior in an animal is not solely by hiding stuff in dirt, right? You can also, spritz some smells around. You can offer some sort of puzzle feeder. There's, ice blocks. There's all kinds of things and ways to go about it to achieve that goal, right? The goal is to get that foraging behavior, maybe that digging behavior. And there are lots of ways to get there. And changing it up keeps things novel, keeps things fun, right? So just understand that, like, say, if you set a goal for yourself, your outcome is that you want to increase your endurance physically, right? You could run on a treadmill. You could go for a walk. You could do various different exercises. You could do some jump rope. You could do all kinds of things that are helping to get you towards that outcome. It frees you up a little bit to not be like, I'm going to the gym and I'm going to go, do a spin class every Tuesday. Yes, you can do that, but you can also swim some laps. You can also, do all these other types of exercises or activities, do some hiking on a weekend. Like, all of these things lead towards that goal of increasing your endurance, which is great. And I don't want you to get so caught up on the action that you forget what the outcome you're aiming for is. That's the whole point. There is a difference between actions and outcomes, and being able to identify one and being able to manipulate it or edit it somehow to make your goals into outcomes that you're searching for, rather than the actions that you've decided arbitrarily that's what you're going to do. Sure, it will get you there to that outcome that you're actually aiming for, but you could do so more easily, more creatively, more fulfilling way, There's a lot of different options available to you as long as you keep the outcome in mind rather than focusing so hard in on the action. Don't train some poor keeper somewhere exactly how to do the task because that's the way you do the task. That's the way you learned it. That's the way everyone else learned it. And then you realize that person's left-handed, right? Don't do what I did. Just because they're left-handed, that doesn't mean that they can't feed these animals, right? No, that's silly. We wouldn't say that. We wouldn't do that. But we also have to be aware that other people are different than us and the way that we learned. And that's okay. The point was we needed this person to learn how to feed these animals and be aware, learn how to work with the tools and the awareness of what was happening and be comfortable doing it. And so that was, once I stopped focusing on the action and broadened my vision to the outcome, we were able to figure out what was going wrong and how to fix it. That's all I'm saying. Please make sure you understand your actions and your outcomes, and you will have a much better time of goal setting and whatnot. Okay, if you have any questions about that or any other management or leadership things or zoo and aquarium stuff, you can always write it in an email. Send it to me at aquatazoo@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, and I hope that you do, don't forget to follow or subscribe on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get all of that sweet, sweet content as soon as it releases. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can find me at patreon.com/aquatazoo. And if you'd like to take a vacation and you don't know where to start, I happen to be a personal vacation advisor with Magical Vacation Planner, and I would love to help you out. It does not cost you anything extra. The links are in the show notes. Okay. Thanks for listening. I heart your faces. Okay, bye.